And so it's time to ask yourself, should I back out? Will this relationship interfere with another? Suppose one has a celibate commitment that's permanent. Well, now we're maybe getting so fond of this person that we say, I may fall in love with this person, and then my commitment will be challenged, and people who are depending upon me in this other role I've committed myself to are going to have difficulties, and so there are all kinds of ramifications. Again, this person has a history of being a little unreliable. If I enter into a marriage with this person, can I hope it's going to be permanent? If we have children, is there going to be a divorce 15 years from now? And then the children are going to get the full brunt of this separation and division. These are the kind of questions, and many others, that arise when one becomes aware that this is a crisis, and that a choice has to be made, and that if I don't back out now and settle for a friendly relationship, it's going to become a friendship from which I cannot back out, and what are the consequences of that? If you decide this person is reliable, you take the risk. You're never going to be more than 80, maybe 81% sure, I don't know. There really isn't any certitude in this life, let's face it. You have a certain amount of evidence, a certain amount of confidence, and you have to rely on your own intuition, especially inspired in prayer, when you feel you've prayed over something and are peaceful about the solution. That's the most security that's available. You could make a mistake, but you don't have to regret it, because you did the best you could. This is all that God, I think, ever asks of anybody. And even that's asking a lot. Well, anyway, here is our relationship with God that's moving into this place as this kind of stable relationship. Now, he gives us the same treatment we may have given him in the beginning. We show up for the interview, but where the heck has he gone to? He never shows up anymore. He gives us the reading of the scripture is like reading the telephone book now. All the liturgy is dry as dust, and no matter how fervent the celebrant is, he leaves us cold, and the sermons are interminable. The lectures go on, even though they're short. And so this sense of being abandoned or deserted, or that God has lost interest in us, it no longer deals with us the way he did at the beginning. He seems to have taken a trip to the uttermost confines of the cosmos and gotten lost as far as we're concerned. And so one begins to ask oneself, what's the use of this thing? I loved him, I did my best, he doesn't show up anymore. And so you become the person on the other end of the phone, and you have the tendency to call it a day, and you say, well, I guess the spiritual journey, divine union, is for other folks, for the Trappists or other cloistered orders who are holed up behind walls and can put their whole mind on this project. I have a family to raise, I have my professional life, my career, my business, just not time, my ministry. So I guess he's not calling me, so I'll settle for Sunday services and maybe a few prayers at bedtime, and hope to receive the last rites of the church a few minutes before death, and to sort of slip into the pearly gates and be happy ever after if I'm lucky. This is not the Christian life. It may be a holding pattern for some people till they get the message, but the gospel is a life to be lived, and if it doesn't grow, it's dying, or it's dead. And so this is a crisis of growth in which God is inviting us to a new level of relating to him, which requires a commitment. And because it requires a commitment, in all honesty, respecting our freedom, he makes it clear to us that this spiritual journey is not a magic carpet into the heights of divine union, that contemplative prayer is hard work, that forging a relationship with the Lord is just as difficult as forging a relationship with a difficult spouse. And you might as well find that out. Take your choice. If you don't want to come, goodbye. I'll be waiting for you. If you change your mind, he says, but if you don't want to get into this thing, you're free. Remember the young man in the gospel that was very fervent, and Jesus said, if you want to be perfect, give all your possessions to the poor and come follow me. Well, he was a very rich young man, and he wasn't prepared to do that. He walked away. Jesus made no effort to get him to stay. He respected the guy's freedom. Now, maybe he just waited till, in 20 years, maybe he became a great apostle. I don't know. But the gospel is delightfully uninterested in satisfying our curiosity, because so many of these pericopes are really not so much about the people, but about us and about our relationship to grace, because the same Spirit, the same Christ who dealt with those people is also dealing with us in the same kind of human situations with our human condition, which is no different. And so when we read about that, we really are reading about ourselves. A good definition for grace, I think, in the context of prayer is the presence and action of Christ, the risen Christ, in our lives right now. This minute, in this room, we have the presence of Christ, which he promised to everybody who come together in his name. And there's no more profound reason for coming together than to share the search, divine union, and for God together. This is kind of a little community this week in which we are joined in a common search around the risen Christ for growth in love, and that presupposes both growth in trust and growth in faith. And so, we decide then, suppose we decide that God is fairly reliable, and we're going to take the plunge on the basis of our experience with him. This is the point, I think, in religious life, that one takes solemn vows, final vows, for instance. And that doesn't take place in most orders for the first 5 or more years, and maybe it should be even longer, because it's a good idea to get to know God pretty well before one gets into this thing for good. The dark side of our personality is a lot darker than we think. And it's not that God isn't wonderful, but living with oneself with the dark side is not so pleasant at times. And this requires an ever-increasing trust in God, because we project on him how we feel about ourselves, and we think, how can he put up with this? How can he stand this? How could anybody, if they really knew us through and through, even say hello or goodbye or smile at us or something? And a God who's so holy, all this is just a lot of misinformation about the spiritual life, of which there's no subject of which there's more ignorance in this world than the spiritual journey. And so people make all kinds of mistakes, and the most characteristic one is to project on God our own human perceptions of things, the way we would react if somebody treated this way, or the way we would feel if someone treated this way. And hence, as we get to know God, trust continuously increases. And we move beyond the level of friendship into a union of life. Or in the case of the contemplative dimension of the gospel, we move to a point of resting in God. Now, resting in God is a classical term used by the fathers of the church to describe what contemplation is. Contemplation is one of those complex terms that comes down in history and is easily misunderstood. For the first 16 centuries of Christian tradition, it always meant this: a resting in God beyond concepts, beyond feeling, beyond particular acts, except to surrender in a general and loving way to God's presence. Now, that wasn't a permanent state, of course, all the time, but it was the ripe fruit of these other levels of relating to God as they became more of a habit and more at ease. And this resting in God refers to the peace, the quiet joy, or the spiritual poise that comes from knowing God well enough not to have to say anything. It's somewhat like the relationship between an elderly couple or a couple who just have just grown in love very fast. I think there are such, and who've developed what might be called an intuitive sense through their bonding of where the other one always is. They always know their mood. So that if the old gentleman comes out after supper and sits on the porch to look at the sunset, his wife, when she comes out, knows instantly whether he wants to talk about the sunset or just sit there and look at it and share this experience together. It's the capacity just to be content in one another's presence. And because you love each other, you don't need anything more. Doesn't mean you never speak, but that every now and then you reach a kind of a peak moment in which you're fully present to each other beyond words and beyond particular sayings. Now, a loving embrace is of that nature. For instance, when you are kissing someone on the mouth out of love, what are you saying? Nothing. It's not the time for chatter. It's the time for receiving this love that is being poured into you gratuitously from the other. So, love enables us to receive as well as to give. And this mutuality is what brings to life all the potentialities of a human being. And in regard to God, it's as though one was resting like a child on the bosom of the parent, or resting in the arms, if you conceive of your relationship with God as a spousal one, or simply a resting in the mystery of God's presence on the level of being without any image, but just relating to God without any attributes, without any personality, so to speak. Of course, God has no personality. We believe that there are three persons, but person in Christian theology means relationship. And the relationships in the Trinity are infinite, but also infinitely different, infinitely one. This is the paradox of reality, that the ultimate reality is a community, but a community that is constantly giving away to each other all that it has. The infinite riches of the Godhead are being passed out, so to speak, totally given to the other, emptying into the other. And the spirit of love, the bond, or the most sweet kiss of the Father and Son, as one of the fathers terms it, the Spirit reconstitutes them forever in their self-giving. So life at the deepest level is self-giving, sacrifice, self-surrender, and the joy of doing so. So our invitation to enter into that rhythm of self-giving and receiving in return is what the spiritual path, as the Christian fathers understood it. Now, in a particular period or interview or encounter with Jesus, using the scripture as our point of departure, all of these acts are possible in the same period of prayer. But obviously one will feel more comfortable in going to that place or in emphasizing that part of the experience in which one's stable relationship expresses itself. So if one is on a level of acquaintanceship, getting acquainted with the Lord of glory, with a little shyness, tongue-tiedness, then the reading provides the topic of conversation, place to start. And one will normally need more reading. One might read most of the time. But there's a tendency in our culture because of the way we're programmed to read everything, especially speed reading, that we feel we've just got to get through this section or this page or this chapter. One has to totally get over that mindset or compulsion and kind of weave one's way through verse after verse, allowing it to sink into our minds and to giving our whole attention to the text, perhaps reading it through maybe once quietly and then taking it very slowly, or just taking it line by line. But when we notice some reflection arising in our mind or some image in our imagination that we feel drawn to or that seems to be beneficial, then we stop reading so as not to jumble those inspirations with too much food. It's as though you're already eating a banquet, so it's like smorgasbord. You can't eat everything. You have to make some selection. So what you feel most attracted to do at the moment, this is usually the indication of how the Spirit is nudging us for today. Because at this level of our spiritual journey or our prayer, benefit or the sense of profiting from a text or reflection is the sign of what God is trying to tell us for the moment, and it will be fruitful. However, after that's been done a while, if one moves to the level of friendliness, then one will spend more time with the reflections. One will still read. At the level of friendship, which always involves commitment, one will feel more attracted to talk to God in your own words or to pour out how you feel about what you've been reading, especially with a certain sense of gratitude and wonder, awe, delight. Now, at this point, you may anticipate the future by a sudden inflow of light that draws you into silence. Now we're not trained in our culture or even in our preaching, as far as I can tell, to be alerted to the fact that an attraction to be still in God's presence is the most intimate kind of attraction. And it would be a lot, to suggest a clumsy example, if a young man took this girl out and spent all kinds of money on it, took her to the movies, they went out for supper, then they had some drinks after the show, took her for a ride, and they arrive at the door, and he says goodnight, and there's no goodnight kiss. In other words, what all the rest of the evening was preparing for is lost. And so, to do Lectio Divina without moving into rest is to leave out the most important part and the purpose for which all the rest is being done. And it's this experience of resting in the love of God that puts all the rest of it into perspective and puts a whole new dimension onto life. I'm not speaking here of romantic love as an ideal, because it has great limitations, but just as an analogy, please. Okay. So the love of God is much more substantial. But in the beginning, I've known people whose experience of God was incredibly romantic. I have a feeling that God gives everybody what they need, so that if you don't believe God is a lover, or if you were deprived of affection as a child from some parents who, for ethnic reasons or some other unfortunate cause, thought they shouldn't touch you or something, so let alone kiss you. So this gives the child the message that it's not lovable. And so somebody has to teach it that it is. Now you're grown up, so your friends are not going to hold you on their lap and treat you like a baby. So God treats you like a baby. And as St. Thomas More in prison, as he was preparing to have his head chopped off for following his conscience, he writes to his daughter Meg, saying about his prayer life, "The Lord dandleth me." You know what dandleth me? On his knees. In other words, he was experiencing God pouring his love into him like into a child that a loving father is kind of playing with it, throwing them up in the air or bouncing them on and playing hobby horse. Many people, I think, who have touches of God's peace, and since they haven't heard about God relating in this way, they think it's something from nature, some indigestion or something. The last thing they think of is that this wonderful feeling of peace is God, because not normally preached that way. Well, anyway, this easily happens when one has poured out one's heart to God over a period of time, and now what one says kind of simplifies down to a sentence or a word. And that word contains a wealth of meaning, knowledge, and human experience, and affirmation. And with that simplification, one easily experiences a moment or two, and maybe longer, of peace, or the transcendent presence of God, sometimes welling up from within, sometimes as if descending from without. And this experience of resting in God can become a permanent state through the development of friendship into a stable union of life. And then resting is possible even in immense activity, because one is relating to God beyond prayer, beyond activity, both of which emerge from his creative activity and are now reflected in one's own consciousness. Now, this is what our retreat is largely about. How to facilitate that experience, which kind of fell out of the Christian experience after the Reformation for various historical reasons, and which is beginning to be renewed largely through the movement of the Spirit and across the church, across the Christian denominations, and manifests most remarkably, it seems to me, in lay folks, in which this hunger for a deeper experience of prayer and some kind of community support system is manifesting itself right across the line in parishes, in religious priests, seminarians, but most of all in lay persons. There are more of them. And so something has to be done to respond to that hunger. It's out there, it's existential. And our tradition speaks with great richness of language and experience and teaching to that need. This will be the need that we'll be addressing during our retreat, and resting in God is what we mean by contemplation. That doesn't put out of business all the other levels of prayer. It simply puts a new perspective on them, deepens their meaning, and the exercise of the other levels at different times of the day, let us say, produces the kind of unified kind of life that brings our interior into oneness with our own nature, and then oneness with the rest of the human family, the cosmos, and especially with God.